Welcome to Thursday Dairy Update. This is Kathy Barrett with the Cornell PRODAIRY program, and the PRODAIRY program, along with Eastern Dairy Business, is pleased to be able to offer this webinar series. Today's webinar is presented by Dr. Mike VanAmburgh. Mike is a professor of dairy management in the Department of Animal Science at Cornell University. Today he's going to be presenting the second part of a two-part series on the Cornell net carbohydrate and protein system. Today he's going to be focusing on what the Cornell model tells us about heifer growth and economics.
So what I'm going to do today, the advertisement talked a little bit about the model and that it kind of implied we had a working calf model and all that kind of stuff. We're not there yet, but we are working on it. But I am going to talk about one model update that does have an impact on heifers, and then some other more herd level modeling that we've been doing. One of my grad students, Henning Heron, who's listed here on the co-authors today, he spent his MPS here working on a spreadsheet model to kind of predict internal herd growth. And it's a little bit different. It's kind of morphed a little bit. Norman St. Pierre kind of did that at Ohio State many years ago, but it wasn't really internal herd growth as much as it was the number of heifers. And then it was adopted some more, and then we took it to adapt it to some current management conditions, and I'll talk about that as we go. So, model updates, the biology of heifers interspersed with some economics and benchmarking, and then a quick summary. So one of the things, for those of you who may not have been on last week, where I did talk about the CNCPS quite extensively, the model has used equations from Terry Sayal, who did his PhD here. Those were also the same equations in the same database used to develop the 2001 NRC equations. The data that Terry pulled together and the way he put it together, in a high-producing lactating cow, those KPs for forage, to the passage rate for forage, would be about 4% per hour on average, with a range from 1.3 to about 7.4. So quite a fast range on NDF or forage passage rate, or quite a high end for NDF passage rate. And what we've realized over time is that was too high. And with the formal release of version 6.5, we started to get feedback from the field and the users that for dry cows, for heifers, and for pasture-fed cattle, it was not working correctly, and the cattle were outperforming the predictions, which meant that the digestibility was higher than we could estimate, even though we had what we thought were really good rates of digestion on the forage itself. It wasn't working right. So we were under-predicting the ME and MP supply. This is the equation that we adapted. We won't spend time on this, just so it's in here and people can see it. This is the same equation that we adopted for CNCPS version 7, and that was during Ryan Higgs' PhD dissertation work, where we converted everything into a new version of the model and added a bunch of new biology and protozoa and things like that. But when we evaluated this equation, it made more sense to us. In the new version, we didn't want to retroactively refit something, but that's where we're at now. And you can see that the predictions of the forage compared with Sayal were approximately half of what the rate was. So Terry's equations were really pushing that forage through the system, and now you're going to see rates of passage of about 1.2 to 2.9% per hour. That's significantly lower, and it's going to increase ruminal digestibility. And then, as I talked about, again, there's always offsetting errors. So if you're going to slow something down and enhance digestibility in the rumen, you better look at the post-ruminal behavior. And we had the intestinal digestibility of NDF set at 20%. And there's nothing in the literature that really supports that high of a post-ruminal NDF for forage digestibility. So if you review some of the current literature, there was a paper by Cornell and Broderick in 2005 where they suggested somewhere between 3 and 5% post-ruminal digestion was pretty good, and that correlates to some other data that we have. So the library was changed to 5%. All right, and so when we put all this together, that leads us to, well, what's the outcome? And so here's version 6.55. This is just a simple example here. I've got a 900-pound pregnant heifer, early pregnancy, 50 days. She's got a 1,650-pound mature body weight. I've got a very simple diet in there. It's 12.4 pounds of corn salad, some 5.5 pounds of mixed hay, some soybean meal to get the protein up, at least keep the ruminal nitrogen up, and minerals and vitamins at 0.2 pounds, so a total intake of just around 20 pounds. If you look at the ME allowable gain of version 6.5, it's 1.8 pounds per day. And if you look at the new version, it's 1.94 pounds per day, so about an 8% increase in the ME allowable gain, and that is moving us in the right direction for quite a while now. I think the model, again, for this reason, has probably been under-predicting the amount of energy those heifers are realizing, and that's probably why some of you users have had some issues with fat heifers despite all the other work that we've done. And then the MP allowable gain also changes. What's interesting is that now that we're using some of that nitrogen to make bugs and kind of moving some things around, you see a little bit of a decrease in the MP allowable gain, which is consistent with what we think is really going on. So just about the same percent, about 6% decrease with about an 8% increase in the ME. So again, these compared to our comparing this to actual data, this is getting us much closer to what the real predictions are. It's very similar to what we're seeing with dry cows and pasture cows. Last week I showed a picture or some data from Ryan Higgs on the prediction of ME and NP allowable milk from pasture-fed cattle, and it is doing a remarkable job now compared to where we were. So this change in passage rate seems to be improving the precision of the model. So that's really about it for the CNCPS and heifers for now. I'm going to come back to it, though, when we talk about target growth a little bit. But I'm actually going to talk about the outcome of not paying attention to the target growth system, because I think we've got some things going on in the dairy industry now that are with heifers that are affecting us, and it has to do with monitoring. So what this really comes down to is I'm going to go through a few slides now that basically just generally describe a replacement program and our goals. And, this seems a little old-fashioned in some regards, but I think it's one of those things that I know that our industry is struggling with. I get these questions all the time, and I struggle with this, So the primary goal of all our heifer programs is to raise the highest quality heifer that can maximize profits in the herd that she's going to be in. And we don't want that heifer to carry any limitations, right? And that's a really big, those two things are really big points. So maximize profits, and the question is how do you define a quality heifer? What are the characteristics? What kind of growth has she had? What kind of environment has she been in? How many treatments has she had? Has she been treated for respiratory all of her life? Is that because she has a weak immune system, or is it because she's been in a terrible environment, and will that create a limitation to her productive ability? And we know the answer to that is true. And then we have to optimize the profits by obtaining the highest quality heifer at the lowest possible cost, usually in the least amount of time. And Jason Carsey's has spent a lot of time on this from a management economic perspective, and I work on the biology and the management side of that. And we're trying to come up with how do we make the best quality heifer, and where are the limitations? And the more we look, the more we realize that there are things going on between mom and baby that in like early life that really impact how that calf uses nutrients, and that may be a setup for the rest of her life. So things like colostrum status, even though we focused on IGs, maybe it's all the other things in colostrum that are impacting the productivity of that calf more than we've ever realized. So lots of biology plays into this. And I think the big thing is the focus on return on investment. Heifers still aren't viewed, we talk about them as the future of the herd, but we don't treat them, I think, the way they probably should be treated in terms of that investment. And it needs to be looked at over their productive life. We really should be saying, okay, we need to calculate the productivity and the profitability of this animal until she leaves the herd. And, is that 2 lactations? Is that 1 lactation? Is that 3 lactations? And I know herd life gets to be one of those kind of nebulous discussions, and why we cull and why cows die and all that. Those get to be kind of difficult topics because it's hard to understand all the decision making. A lot of it has to do with perceived economics, and I'm going to try to tie some of that together, because it's really a lifetime function. We want to minimize the non-completion rates, and we used to talk about internal herd growth. We still do. Many years ago, several people, the PRODAIRY group, Jason, John Conway, and several others kind of figured out that the most profitable herds in the state were those that had an internal herd growth of 8% or higher. And there was a lot of debate about what does internal herd growth mean. If you just need more animals, you can go buy them. But what it really implies is that the management of the farm is such that your DOAs are low, your non-complete, that you're bringing a lot of heifers into the herd, and that you have the ability, you have the management capacity to actually grow your herd in a very productive way, and then decide how you're going to use those assets. So that's still a viable benchmark, and I think that's important. And one aspect of that is something like milk per day of life, and I remember that used to be published on DHI sheets, and I don't see that anymore. But some characteristic of how am I doing over the life of this animal? How is she paying back? When does she pay for herself? Are all factors that we should be focused on here. And I think right now, with margins as tight as they are, that is one. So the growth benchmarks, I think, are important, and this is where we're going to spend some time here in a few minutes. And I think, meeting the benchmarks for growth and calving to optimize first lactation and subsequent lactation milk yield. I mean, it's not just the first lactation we're worried about here. It's the life of the animal. So when you talk about calving, we talk about how fat they are, how light they are, general conditions. I think all of this plays into it, respiratory. But, a long time ago, and I'm putting this back out there because I think for I met with a group this morning who touches a lot of cows, and, this is still relevant. What I'm realizing is some of this is still relevant because we're not taking the time to actually do some of this benchmarking just to get a snapshot of where herds are at. We talk about quality. Well, first calf heifer is treated as a calf or heifer. We want, years ago we came up with this, we want that to be less than 30% of all the animals. The question is when does that happen? 24 hours to 3 months. If the majority of the time it happens there, it says we have to do a better job with our housing and our nutrition and our colostrum program. If it happens from 4 months to fresh, then it really gets into some other management concerns where they're at, and maybe it still plays off the colostrum. But knowing where that treatment is taking place has a big impact on future milk. We know that those calves from birth to 3 months, if there's a lot of those treated, we're going to lose milk when they get to be adults. We've got that documented. So that's a pretty big concern. And then, if it's happening later, maybe that's an animal that doesn't need to stay in the herd. DOAs, how's your protocol for DOAs? Do you have a lot of them? Do you have more males than you have females? Well, maybe if you have more males than females, there's a bias there. Knowing where that partition at has a lot to do with internal herd growth and profitability. Peak in total milk yield in the first lactation greater than 80% of the mature. This is a real struggle right now. And I think because of cull prices here in the last couple of years and some other things, and the fact that we're growing a lot of heifers in some herds, that's gotten us into trouble because we're not monitoring as well as we should. And then some of those other things like culls, MEs, number of treatments in lactation, things like that, and then just herd life or retention. So this snapshot can be quite useful to producers or to anybody who's interacting with the dairy to kind of, one more time kind of step back and say, okay, what does this herd really look like? And there's a few things on here I know that aren't being met right now in the Northeast. And one of those is this whole thing about monitoring. My group and several other groups have spent a lot of time the last 10 years doing some of the the gee whiz kind of stuff, right? And I love working on the gee whiz stuff. How do we take the components of colostrum and make a calf grow faster? How do we get them to change how they partition nutrients? How do we, get more mammary development? How do we do all this stuff? But one of the things that has come back here lately is the fact that, we can do all that and we can do a great job with the calf, but once we get past that stage, we've got to keep after them and maintain and monitor them. And I know this is one of the hardest things to do on a dairy. I make jokes about this. I don't mean them to sound as bad as they do, but one of my comments has been, well, so you're a nutritionist and you go to a farm and you meet the dairy producer and they say to you, I need more milk and I need it to be cheaper. And you say, great, how much milk are you making and what's it costing you? And they say, I don't know how much milk I'm making and I don't know what it's costing me right now, but I need more and I need it to be cheaper. All right, so if you got that kind of information or that kind of feedback, what decision do you make? And you probably wouldn't make a very informed decision because you don't have anything to work from. So I get that a lot. I get a lot of phone calls and people say, I need a better heifer program. And I'll say, with that, what are you doing right now? And they don't really know because nobody's monitoring. I don't get any feedback. So I don't really know how to make a better heifer program because I don't know where they're at. And to me, it's a real problem. I'm going to show you what it looks like with some case study information here in a minute. So we've had these benchmarks for a long time. We've talked about double the body weight at birth for at least 10 or 12 years now. Puberty, we know that happens somewhere around 45%, at least 45% of mature weight. Breeding and pregnancy should happen somewhere between 55 and 60% of mature weight if we're going to optimize at least first lactation milk yield. First lactation post-calving body weight at 82 to 85% mature weight. These, those benchmarks, at least the breeding and pregnancy and the post-calving body weights are all buried within the CNCPS. So this is partly related to the modeling. That's the target growth system that we devised a long time ago. And how do you get the mature weights? Well, if you have them, third and fourth lactation cattle in the middle of their lactation, somewhere between 80 and 200 days in milk on healthy cows, not cull cows, right? And any way you can do this is great. Had a group this morning asked me what percent of the herds are actually achieving that 82 to 85%. And our 82 is our number. The NRC committee picked 85 to be more conservative. The data from Alex Bach in Spain that he generated would say 81%. So somewhere between 81 and 82% is really the threshold on that. But they asked, is anybody achieving that? And I said, no, not really. And then Julio Giordano, our reproductive physiologist, challenged me one day and says, well, Mike, if nobody's achieving it, is it the right objective? And I said to him, yes, I know it's the right objective. The problem is that we don't have a monitoring system, and he's the guy that's so invested in monitoring. Yet, for all the sophisticated monitoring that we're doing, we've had scales forever, and nobody wants to use them. All right, and I find that really funny when I think about how sophisticated we've made our industry and the kinds of decisions that we make, but yet we can't get people to run heifers and calves across scales effectively. And they're not that expensive. I know it's the labor and the time and the facility structure, but there's got to be something there. And the reason I'm making a big deal of that is this, So this is a farm. This is a case study herd from Fellows. And I use this particular graph, and I use this lactation plot. And I use this graph and this herd because as we were getting ready to do this herd, the nutritionist had said to us, you got to find the milk. The extension specialists, you got to find the milk. The veterinarian, you got to find the milk. The herd owners, boy, we really want to know why we can't make any milk. We're busting our butts and we're not making any milk. And so we looked at the herd. Calves looked awesome, great calf facility. Heifers looked tremendous up until breeding. Got the heifers pregnant. things didn't look so good or quite as good after that. Heifers are okay, but not quite as good. And what you see here is very typical of what we're seeing in a lot of herds, where you've got decent peak on the heifer or on the third lactation cows, you got a decent peak on the second lactation cows, and those heifers just aren't doing it, you know. And I don't get worked up about heifers that don't peak until their fifth test. I've never really worried about that. Sometimes heifers just have to grow into it. Depends on the environment, depends on the diet, depends on how much they still have to grow, but it has to be somewhat relative. And the real problem here is that they're not where they're supposed to be. It doesn't have to be here, but even if you take their peak and work backwards, it's still not at the right stage. And this graph came out, you know, after, you know, the farm would go back to do the diagnostics, and the students, this is one of the first things they printed out, and sure enough, there's the milk, all right? Peak, 69% of the mature cows. Overall lactation, 69% of the mature cows. You take the heifers out there, a 32,000 pound herd. And there's a lot of heifers in this farm right now because cull prices were high, cash made for nice cash flow, did have a bunch of heifers coming in. They didn't lose a lot of heifers. They just weren't getting to the benchmark. The hard part here is that 6 out of 6 Fellows case studies, and so it's a Fellows case study herd, 6 out of 6 herds that we've analyzed in the last year and a half have all had the same problem. And I was so we're doing a good job with calves. We're doing a good job getting them pregnant relatively on time. A little bit of distribution. I'm not going to talk about distribution today entirely. But the bottom line is that we're not meeting the benchmark because we're not monitoring as well as we should. And I was kind of making the point that I was in a meeting here this morning, and they asked me how many herds are meeting the benchmark, and I said not too many. Julio Giordano, you know, is challenged me a little bit, saying, well, maybe you don't have the right benchmark, but all the data we said tells us we have the right benchmark. We just don't have a simple way to do the monitoring. We can't put a collar on them and get body weights, or put an ear tag in them and get body weights. We got to use the scale. All right, and I think figuring out how to justify that is getting easier, looking at the economics and the margins of milk production that are associated with this. And, you know, lots of discussion about how do we forward predict this, and I don't really want to worry about forward predicting the loss. I want to figure out how to manage the heifers to not lose it. You know, and we had a discussion group a year ago where we spent time trying to understand. You know, the challenge from the discussion group was, you know, how do we optimize first lactation milk yield and the quality of the heifer as she arrives at first lactation? And well, this got into all sorts of things relative to housing and management, nutrition, colostrum, vaccinations. We covered the waterfront. But the one thing that became apparent is that a lot of those herds, the 12 herds that I have listed here, they weren't monitoring very well. And when we looked at first lactation milk yield relative to mature cows, only 2 of them were really hitting the benchmark. One of them, actually, this is a herd where the mature cows aren't performing the way they're supposed to, so it makes the heifers look good. So I don't believe that number. This one's pretty much right on. We've got a few herds here right at 79, but we see quite a range there, anywhere from 68 on up to about 82. So there's quite a bit of milk potential being lost there, because we've got heifers that are going to partition nutrients to growth in place of lactation, and that isn't all bad. Calving early is always better than calving late. So sometimes you have to say, you know what, if my option is to calve later, that's less cost effective than calving early and losing a little bit of milk. But we know that it's possible to get this body weight if we institute the right monitoring after we get them pregnant. You know, and I've been asked here lately, you know, if it's a 15, 16-month-old heifer that's pregnant, can you recover that? And the answer is yes. If it's a 20 or 21-month-old heifer and she's going to calve at 22 or 23, the answer is no. There's really nothing you can do at that point. So it's one of those things where, like everything in the dairy industry, we have to be systematic about it and figure out, you know, regular monitoring intervals for those pregnant heifers. And I know the last couple of years we've had really brutally cold winters, and that has not helped this case whatsoever, because I know there were heifers that were were really in trouble the last couple of years when we got into that January, February, March time period with as cold as it was. So that is not helping these scenarios out at all. But I think one of the things that I saw happening here, and I've said this to a few groups, and they've gone out and actually analyzed some herds, and my grad students this morning told me the research farm is the same way a little bit. It was all that we weren't culling and just not meeting the benchmarks, But I think something that I see the last couple of years is milk price was high, right? That made us feel good, but cull prices were also high, right? And in most cases, the cull value of the animal is almost equal to the heifer rearing cost. So that decision-making process was pretty easy at that point. But what I've seen happening is we now have a lot of herds that are more than 35% first lactation animals, and I've seen some herds here lately that are 45 to 50% first lactation animals. That's a lot. And it didn't get that way because they've got poor management. They get that way because they made the decision to capitalize on that high cull price, and they got rid of animals that, in other years they probably would have held on to. But where things went wrong is that we didn't do, either we had cold winters or we didn't do the right kind of monitoring once we got them pregnant, and we're calving in at body weights below that benchmark of 82%. So I did a few calculations. I said, well, if we expect milk, if the expected milk of the targets met should be, let's say, 90 pounds at peak. So I'm trying to give you some example of the value of this monitoring. And again, this is all buried in our nutrition model, but not with all the economics tied to it. We're working towards that end. But so, and I think I'm being conservative here. Some people might argue with that, but I say about 225 pounds of milk for every pound at peak in a well-managed herd. So let's say in the example I just gave you, we're off by at least 11 pounds. So we should expect 11 pounds of greater peak at 225 pounds per pound. That's about 2,600 pounds of unrealized milk due to not meeting the 82%. If we're at 1680 net milk price, which may be a little bit generous right now for some people, and an 833 income over feed cost margin, that's $215 per first lactation heifer and income over feed costs, which right now would look pretty good. In an 800 cow herd, which is what this was, 40% first lactation animals, that's 320 heifers. That's about $69,000 in income over feed costs that's not realized, or about $86 per cow. So what I'm trying to do here for everyone is to put a value to this monitoring in what it's worth to get to that 82% for a herd. And I don't think it's that hard. I don't think there's any magic to it. I think the problem is that we just don't know how those heifers are growing. They're not dying. They look healthy. They've always got feed. They may be in marginal conditions in terms of their housing, and they may look kind of okay, but maybe they're just not achieving that benchmark, and that's what it's worth. And if you do have a better milk price, you do the same calculation. Now you're looking at $100,000 of income over feed costs. So it's a significant amount of money in one of those situations where for all the things that we want to do on one end, getting this end of the growth curve where it's supposed to be is actually worth a lot of money, and applying target growth to this appropriately is good. And the modeling aspect of this is fairly easy, actually. It is the monitoring part of it that gets to be pretty hard. So we got to go out and figure out how to monitor those heifers. A scale's not that expensive when you look at this kind of income over feed costs. And I know the labor is hard and some of the facilities aren't set up right, but there's a lot of money here right now that we're not realizing. It wouldn't bother me so much, except I've seen way too many herds like this here recently, and we've been after these benchmarks for a long time. So here's just everybody's seen this kind of slide. I'm not going to spend any time on it except to say that we know how to do this and we can actualize it, right? So that's, just got to get out and do it. So the other question then, and I kind of alluded to this a few minutes ago, there's some new data out. I'm not sure that everybody's seen it, so I want to share it with you. Some of it's our data that's a little bit older, but I want to pair it up with that. But that begs the question of when should you calve them in? And, And this gets into risk management. And as I just said, you know what? I always want to calve them, even if they're light, I want to calve them early because I don't want to have to manage the inventory. All right, and I don't think I have the slide in here, but that inventory slide of age of first calving and cull rate that Bill Menzie came up with many, many, many years ago, and Jason's modified, and we all use it. You know, it's the inventory cost that really kills you when you increase your age of first calving. And I'll show you what that looks like in a very simple exercise here before I'm done. But calving early is really calving as early as possible. Really should be the ultimate goal. And then obviously we want to hit that benchmark. So some old data that Bob Everett helped me generate after some fierce conversations with a winter dairy management course one year. So we got a lot of time in the car and a lot of time drinking some wild turkey. Bob liked his wild turkey. And matter of fact, he gave me his motorcycle for a couple bottles of wild turkey once. That's after he bought his Corvette, of course. He didn't need his motorcycle anymore. But that's how much he liked it. But we had this big conversation about, longevity, and Bob was very concerned about the fact that when he started putting out the Northeast Sire Summary, for those of you old enough to remember stuff like that, he used to publish herd life, and he kept doing that, but herd life went, he used to publish 72 months day abilities, and then he had to publish 60 months day abilities, and then he had to publish 48 months day abilities, and then at the very end there, before he retired and moved on, he was talking about 36 months day abilities, and it really bothered him that he had spent his career trying to figure out how to improve all this, and the industry had gone just the opposite direction. So we were trying to figure out, how much of longevity was tied to things like age of first calving. Again, we were just trying to find all sorts of characteristics. So we had 2.5 million lactations, about 937 herds in the West and in here, and we looked at, using his test day model, we looked at all sorts of analyses, and we basically set each herd, the average of each herd, to 0. So we set the age of first calving age to 0, so it was 25 months, and it was 25 months, and that was 0, and then we looked at the standard deviation around that, and that gave you these kinds of breakdowns everywhere from 21 days around the age of first calving to 22 to 63, and then greater than or less than 63. And we did the same thing for age of first calving. They gave us 5 groups, so the mean of the whole data set was 25.6 months at the time, and the range was roughly 23 to 30. And then that, quite frankly, that range hasn't changed much since we did this. I've looked here again recently, and you'd be surprised how many animals are calving out at 30 months. And then that's one of the other things that needs to be addressed is, when do we make the decision to cull a heifer and move her on and not hold her in the herd? But when we looked at productivity and looked at productive days, those animals calving at 23 months were always the more productive animals in terms of productive days. And this is the difference from the mean. And the old thought was you calve in an older animal and she would make a lot more milk and catch up. And the answer to that is no, they tend to leave the herd about the same time. So if you want more productive days, you calve them in early. And you can see across that range anywhere from, basically about 60 days from the mean all the way up to over 200 days to the range. And if you looked at total milk production and the difference from the mean, you see the same kind of thing, that those younger producing animals, you see a slope here as you get out to 7 and 8 years, but we don't have animals out here. We don't have very few animals out here. We're really in this range right here. So it basically says from this data set, you want to calve them early, and I will add, and if you beat the benchmark, it's going to make this look even better, because none of that thinking could be superimposed on this study. All right, so basically this said that younger animals were more productive and had longer herd life. This data from Wisconsin was published a couple years ago now, and in 69,000 heifers, and they calving in 2005, so it's a retrospective again, but it's similar to what I just showed you from our own data set. What they tried to do is stratify by level of milk production. So they looked at 3X milking, what they called high, so 28,000, 3X milking medium, about 25,000, 2X medium, about 25,000, and then 2X low, about just over 20,000 rolling herd average. All right, and that's how they stratified this, and they were wondering if the level of milk production had something to do with what herd life, productivity, and days in the herd look like. So if you looked at exit age, total days, and you looked at, so the 2X, actually, if you follow that line, they have the longest days in the herd, and the rest of them are all down here when you get out to about an age of first calving of 30 months. But you can see that the older you calve them, the more total days you have by age of first calving when stratified by milk yield, right? It goes that direction. And that kind of makes some sense, I think, because as you get older, you're going to be around longer. The question is what about your productivity? So this is days milked. And I think this is rather intriguing. So if you look at the total days milked, this has got all the noise of all the information in there, but if you were to draw a regression line, everybody can see that regression line is basically going to go up like this. And that total days milked is actually the greatest as we go towards the younger animals. There's a little bit of noise here in this 2X. It kind of drops fast and then comes back up. So I'm not sure what that's telling us here around this 21-month age of first calving. I think it's just probably animal numbers, but I don't know the data that well. But the general trend is the younger you calve them in, the more days of milk you get. And if you look at lifetime milk yield, the younger you calve, if you're a 2X herd in a stanchion barn or in a tie stall barn, which is really how they had this represented, it really doesn't matter. But that's still important because it says, you know what, you want to calve as early as possible because it doesn't matter. So you want to keep them around. You want to lower the inventory by calving as early as possible. And then for the rest of them, it's basically the same kind of trend. So this data very nicely says, you know what, barring anything else, calve as early as possible because that's how we're going to optimize lifetime milk yield. And if we don't optimize lifetime milk yield, if there's really no relationship there, at least we're going to lower the amount, the inventory amount of heifers that we have to carry to maintain a static herd size. And there's a lot of money in that if you think about what it's costing everybody to raise a heifer today. So when all else fails, go lighter, lose a little bit of milk. But if you can go earlier and meet the benchmark, I think the industry is going to pick up a lot of income. All right, and we looked at something like this. This is from a study that from one of those discussion group herds. This is something that Katie Andrews put together, and I finally got the right numbers. Copying and pasting things that had calculations in them doesn't always work. Bottom line here is that when you looked within this herd, so this is one herd evaluation, you see this is the range in age of first calving, 20 to over 27 months. And you can see the number of heifers in each one of those categories. And what I'll draw your attention to over here is basically the total net margin and the net margin per heifer completing, right? And I think this is really the number that everybody should be interested in. And the maximum net return per heifer completing was at 22 months age of first calving. Right behind that were those animals calving at 21 months. And you can see how fast that dropped once you got beyond that 22-month age of first calving. And these are the kinds of comparisons that I think we need more of to drive this idea home and to analyze each herd to understand the dynamics. Not every herd is the same, but the more I look at this kind of data, that's why I showed you the Wisconsin data, that's why I showed you our data on productivity. The more data we look at, it's those younger animals that are the more productive ones and work the hardest and are the easiest to get bred back. And those of you that are getting up in years like me, I'm not that old, but I'm getting older. I can't physically work as hard as I did when I was 25. I can work a long time. But if you parallel that with a cow, those younger cows can outwork the older cows. That's just how it all works. We all know that. But profitability is really tied to that, and I think we need to be paying attention.
So, Mike, could you just explain these two numbers here?
Yeah, so the two numbers here, the 22 months, so the cows called it less than 60 days in milk. So that is the net margin loss of those cows added back into the calculation. And then the cows culled greater than 60 days, that's the net margin increase of those cows that were retained in the herd for that period of time. So we were trying to treat, if they're culled less than 60 days, you basically don't make you actually lose a bunch of money. But if you get to milk them for so many days, you're going to make some money on them. And that's what that number is that's added back to the system. So again, trying to be very fair to the data and say, hey, you know what, if you lose an animal early in the game, she costs you a bunch of money, you better add that back to your net calculation, because we've seen people not add that back in, and that's a disservice to your profitability calculation in that situation. Okay. And that kind of comes back to this graph. This was something that Roger Cady and Terry Smith put together for the first heifer meeting back in 94 or 96, I'm forgetting right now, but it was basically to look at, when the calf is and the heifer's born and you go all the way out to age of first calving, when does she start to pay herself back? And that's really what this represents. So here's the nadir, it cost you $1,000 to get to this point, you calved her back in and she's making money back, and she crossed the line in terms of paying for herself at about 42 months of age in this scenario, and she calved at 24 months. Well, this is the heifer that didn't calve until 30 months, and she doesn't pay back until almost 53 or 54 months. And we tend not to think this way because of the value of the cull and things like that. And this actually says, you know what, this helps you with the cull value, and we tend to add the cull value back into this to justify our decision-making process. But that leads sometimes to, what it did here lately with high coal prices is we didn't really care. Coal prices are down, milk prices down. I think people have to care, because when I start looking at herd life, I'm seeing 1.6 to 1.8 lactations, maybe 2 lactations for herd life out there. And the question is, okay, when is she now paying for herself? And if she's paying for herself about the time that she crosses that line, then our real net margin is really on our cull value. And not on the milk. The milk's just cash flowing the system. So one of the things that and this gets back to what Henning Heron had worked on as part of his master's, and we're still trying to clean this all up, and I'm going to go a little fast through some of these slides, but the question that we've been asking is, when does she pay for herself? With modern breeding strategies, what does that do for internal herd growth? Because in the last few years, we've had sex semen. But we also have sex semen for beef animals. We've got strategies out there where people are snipping, doing genomic analysis on their heifers and selecting the highest 50% and applying sexed Holstein semen or sexed dairy semen to them, those heifers, and then maybe for the rest of them, they're selecting beef bulls, right, to increase their marginal profit on the lower end of the genetics. There's all sorts of strategies going on. And I get asked these questions all the time. How do you make an assessment of whether this is a good decision or a bad decision given all this new technology? Or what's the effect of a high cull rate or a non-completion rate over time, whether it's a chronic decision or a targeted decision? What does it do over a 10-year period? So what we put together, again, this is some more modeling, was a spreadsheet, a fairly sophisticated spreadsheet. Again, it's not quite ready for use yet because we've got to clean a few things up, but we're moving that direction, which is why I'm showing you this. So it actually will let you do 3 scenarios. In this case, we're using a 500 cow herd. And we've got, you can see in scenario 1 and scenario 2, you've got 40% first lactation versus 30% first lactation. You got 35 versus 30 on second. You got 25 versus 40 on third lactation. So, that basically describes a slightly different culling strategy, right? And then you can get herd cull rates here. I have those kind of set up to be the same because you don't want to make too many changes if you're doing a comparison. But I just want to show you that this kind of information, it would take you some time to do this, but it would also force you to understand the characteristics of your herd and what you do. How do you cull? Why do you cull? Who sold, what the price is, what the cull weight might be, some DOAs. There's lots of things in here. I'm hiding a bunch of inputs. But this is just a basic way to get the herd characterized in terms of your herd structure, and then describing some of the other characteristics. How are you going to use semen? Are you using standard semen? What percent female? So in this case, we're using kind of a standard semen. There's our calving interval. There's our average days milk. There's our relative milk production over the first 3 lactations and net milk price, your feed costs, and so you get your net margin. And then we've got an opportunity cost in the calculator, so you can always do something else with your money and your time. This is the one, and I had several groups ask me these questions, so we have it set up to do these kinds of calculations now. Is what percent of the herd is going to receive, and who's going to receive sex semen versus non-sex semen versus beef semen. And this is actually set up for the entire 10-year forecast. And this takes a little bit of time, but it allows you to look at strategies of, do you want to change your breeding strategy for the heifers? Do you want to change your breeding strategy for the first lactation animals? What will that do to your internal herd growth? What does it do to the number of heifers? Things like that. All right, so it allows you to go in and make those changes. And then, again, lots of inputs here. You got to describe your heifers. And there's a few things we need to change here, but how many heifers do you currently have? What's your cull rate or your non-completion rate? What's the value of the heifer that gets sold? What's it cost you per day? What's your targeted age of first calving? What's your animal values for heifer calves, bull calves, beef calves, things like that? What's the Springer value? And the capital investment per animal. So lots of these things, lots of these inputs, same thing you'd see on lots of other financial calculations, but we were trying to make sure that we could characterize the herd and characterize the decision making, because you could say, if I want to drop my age of first calving, for example, what does that do to my profitability? What does it do to my internal herd growth? What does it do to my cost structure around the heifer enterprise? And then we do the break-evens. When is it paying off, right? And this is a very complex slide, and I'm going to keep going, but it basically would give us our total raising costs in these scenarios, and then how many days would you have to milk those cows to get that heifer, or would she have to be milked to pay for herself? And then it does all of those projections, and just like in the old calculator, it'll give us the internal herd growth over the 10 years for the different scenarios, right, and how you set that up so you can do those comparisons. And then in the end, the two things that are of most interest to everybody, and these are the outputs, what's it cost you per day to raise a heifer? What's your total rearing cost? So you can see in the examples, and I'm not really doing this justice because there's a lot of detail here. I'm just trying to give you a kind of a glimpse at how we're trying to do this. Across these scenarios, anywhere from $2,200 to $2,600 to raise these heifers. What's the income when they leave the herd? What's our total raising cost? What's the income per year? Purchased expense. So we're trying to do some enterprise calculations, and you can see, sometimes heifer programs don't return. All right, and they're not necessarily designed to return, but it allows you to at least look at that in a snapshot and say, well, I got to make some changes here to make this more cost effective. And again, we're still working out some of these calculations, but as Jason Carses would say, does it pass the smell test? And so far, most everything passes the smell test when we put it up against a real herd, but we're still doing some testing, but we're pretty close to letting it go. And then you get to something like this, the herd projections. What are you projected to grow over 10 years? How many days to pay off? That should be from first calving. Lactations to pay off from first calving. So you can see here in these two scenarios, in this scenario one, that animal's going to pay herself off by 1.3 lactations. In the second scenario, she's not going to pay herself off for 2.1 lactations. Well, if your average herd life is 1.9 lactations, or 2 lactations, then basically in scenario 2, that animal's never really going to pay herself off, so she's actually costing you money the way you currently got your heifer program set up. And then we can look at days of payoff since birth, and that basically gets us in there, depending in the same calculation, depending on how many lactations and when she calved in. So it allows us to make those analyses, again, with some of the modern decision-making we have with the availability of sex semen, beef semen, things like that. So here's a very simple scenario. This one makes perfect sense to everybody. If I set everything the same and all I do is change the age of first calving, right, what does it look like? Well, as I go from 26 months to 22 months, my internal herd growth increases, my days to payoff decreases, so just dropping the age of first calving by a couple months, my days to payoff 1.2, my number of lactations 1.2 versus 1.4, right? But this is also interesting because everybody has a distribution around your age of first calving. Nobody has a number. Everybody has a distribution. So when we start looking at the dynamics of this, and this is one of the things we're thinking about and how to capture this relative to the herd, is looking at this in a more stochastic way, putting the variation here and saying, you know what, we're paying off in 1.4 plus or minus so many lactations, and our herd life is 1.9 plus or minus so many lactations, and it allows you to look at really a better perspective, give you a better perspective on how your heifer enterprise is playing into your profitability and your herd growth. But I think this to me is getting to be a bigger concern because I'm seeing the herd life decrease quite a bit, and I'm seeing these payoff calculations get to be up towards 1.6, 1.7 lactations, which is about the time that a lot of cows are starting to leave the herd, which means she's not really paying for herself. And I'm not sure long-term that's a great strategy because it basically says it's just like other industries where the primary product gives us cash flow, but it's the byproduct that gives us the profitability. And the byproduct would be the value of the cow at the end of her lactation. So these are things that I think we need to be paying attention to, and we're trying to come up with a tool that lets us do this effectively. Somebody else out there that's listening knows where there is something like that, please let me know because I'd like to take a look at it. So in summary, productive days in milk is greater for heifers with a lower age of first calving. Economic analysis indicates that lower age of first calving is more advantageous. Lower age of first calving requires fewer replacements per year to maintain the herd size, and this inventory reduction has significant financial implications. And I think that's a really big deal right now. And the inventory is the larger cost of the decision to calve younger. But I do think, as I'll come back to, meeting those benchmarks for growth also plays a pretty big part in this calculation right now for profitability and we're just not doing it. It has to do with monitoring. We got to figure out how to get scales out there and get facilities where we can get heifers run across scales to make sure that we achieve that 82% post-calving body weight.
This is Kathy Barrett again, and on behalf of the PRODAIRY program and dairy business, I'd like to thank you for taking the time to view this webinar.